Three, two, one. Joining us now is Andy Thayer, the leader of the campaign against NATO and G8. He was an instrumental figure in organizing the protests last week in Chicago against the NATO summit. He's a proud alum of Northwestern University and a resident of the city of Chicago, and an all-around great guy. Andy Thayer, pleasure to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alan.
Good. So let me ask you. Let me start out a little bit. Let me ask you about the actual protests that happened last weekend in Chicago. There was a lot of trepidation on the part of many people, myself included. That something not so pleasant might go down vis-a-vis Chicago 1968. Tell me a little bit more about what went down.
Did go down, Alan. They were more subtle about it than in 1968, but some very unpleasant things did go down. We still have a number of people incarcerated thanks to the actions of the CPD. It's just they were not quite as blatant about it as they were back in 68.
So tell me a little bit more about what went down at the march on, I believe, Friday and Saturday, or Saturday and Sunday, excuse me. So tell me a little bit more about what went down.
Was actually there was a permanent march, big march on Sunday the 20th, which is the opening date of the NATO summit here. And we literally had to fight for nearly 11 months to finally get the permits, finally get the pieces of paper to allow us to exercise our First Amendment rights. But the city of Chicago, I think, was playing a double game all along. For one thing, they delayed us on the whole permit stuff and got us wrapped up into a pretty ridiculous permit battle that, while it was useful in helping us publicize not just the march itself, but showed the hypocrisy of the Emmanuel and Obama administrations in terms of their alleged commitment to free speech rights. At a certain point, they also became quite debilitating, I believe, in that they took us away from other stuff that would have been far more fruitful for our work, especially in the last week. In the city of Chicago, right at the end of our permitted march, basically decided that they were going to show who's boss and took a very aggressive action against protesters and kettling us in the area around Cermak in Michigan. Now, yes, the permit was over with, but the sensible thing for the city of Chicago to have done at that point was to just chill out. And instead, they virtually surrounded most people and sent a very intimidating message, and then began pushing into the crowd, and things sort of went south from there. There was no pressing national security reason to clear the intersection of Cermak and Michigan on that afternoon, but the city nonetheless decided to get all macho and show who's boss. So it was quite disturbing in that respect. And it should be noted, Alan, also that in the week prior to the demonstration, the city did a number of so-called anti-terrorism raids that really look like set-up jobs, and we've got some young men now who are facing very serious so-called terrorism charges, which look to be probably none other than just set-up jobs by CPD agents trying to justify their own salaries and budgets.
Well, let me touch on that really quickly, because that's something that's very, very disconcerting to me, because there is a history of local police departments like the Chicago Police Department, with the Black Panthers back in the 60s, but also with the FBI. They're notorious for entrapping people. It seems to me that that's just a case of deja vu. Now, for you as, one of the leaders, or at least, a very active, visible member of the movement, do you ever wrestle with the fear of perhaps being infiltrated by the FBI or being set up or something happening to you like what happened to those 3 or 4 gentlemen in Bridgeport?
Oh, we just assumed that we were infiltrated. Just as a matter of course, I think you'd have to be pretty damn naive not to. I mean, we had, for example, for organizing for a march on the second anniversary of the Iraq invasion back in 2005. Thanks to later court filings, we found out that there were two CPD officers in at least a few of our meetings, and we never found out who they were. But thanks to a civil suit that I got against the city, we found that out about a much lesser event back there in 2005. So I think anyone that knows the history of this country, certainly knows the history of the CPD and the FBI, would assume that we were infiltrated. What was really disturbing, we thought that when our Cook County Sheriff, Tom Dart, boasted about filling up the old Joliet prison with mass arrests of
Yes.
protesters, and when the Milwaukee Red Cross sent a blast email talking
Yeah,
about the mass evacuation of
yeah,
the city of Chicago, Milwaukee.
yeah. That was very almost Orwellian. I mean, just the thought of even talking about evacuating the city of Chicago. I mean, is there some kind of ulterior motive? Are they trying to scare people?
Absolutely, Alan. And I wrote a Trib op-ed to that effect, that this was a direct attack on the First Amendment, that the city of Chicago, the mayor through his various underlings and so forth, was attempting to send a message that people should not go out and exercise their First Amendment rights for fear of being beaten down by the police or whatever. That this was a direct attempt to intimidate people from exercising their right to peaceably assemble and protest.
Let me ask.
And it did have an effect on our protests. A lot of people told me that they weren't going to come out because they were frankly afraid.
I mean, it was almost surreal. I mean, they closed down whole parts of the city. I mean, they had Black Hawk helicopters flying, in very close formation between downtown skyscrapers. I mean, the whole thing was almost surreal. I couldn't believe my eyes. Let me ask you something. You know, there has also been a history, aside from just infiltration, of agent provocateurs. Undercover policemen or FBI agents, or even just paid informants. Usually, just paid informants that will attend, we'll say, a rally and wreak havoc. And give the authorities the excuse they need to violently crack down. Have you seen any of that in recent years in the city of Chicago?
Well, not, it's difficult to say, Alan, because, I mean, who's to know who is CPD and who isn't, unless it comes out in the wash several years later as part of a court case, or in the case of a number of the FBI files during the Vietnam War. People actually raided some of the local offices and spilled that information. But you never know at the end of the day. I do know that from the Miami Anti-Free Trade of the Americas protests, that there is videotape of alleged black bloc, alleged anarchists who were actually faded into the police lines after they did their shit. So it was clearly a setup job so as to justify repression upon protesters, anarchists, and non-anarchists alike. And this is one of the reasons why we here in Chicago adopted something we called the Chicago protests, the Chicago principles, I should say, whereby we were not going to trash talk people of different political persuasions who joined in the protest, because it just really played into the cops, into the so-called anti-violence meme that they were really trying to push, to pit protester against protester, when really the leading cause of violence in the world today is, of course, the United States government, to quote Dr. King. And that the violence that is daily meted out by NATO in a far more calculated and expansive fashion makes any violence by police or protesters here in the city of Chicago pale by comparison. This is why I kept on getting annoyed at these questions by our mainstream media here, where they kept on bringing up, oh, but what about violence? But what about violence? And
Right.
I had to finally come back at a few of them and said, okay, are we concerned about violence in general, or just violence against white people? Are we concerned about violence in general, or are we just concerned about violence against Americans.
Right.
Because it really strikes me as, given that the scale of the violence committed by NATO, supported war attack style, supported by this president, supported by this mayor, and those guys aren't getting these kind of questions from you guys. It seems to me that your real concern is about violence against white people and violence against Americans, which strikes me as a rather racist concept. So excuse me if I don't fall into directly addressing your question.
No, I understand. Tangents are welcome. But I
I'm
kind of
talking
want.
about their questions now,
That's
not yours.
fine. That's fine. All's forgiven. I kind of wonder when I see video clips of violence by the NYPD, for example, against Occupy Wall Street protesters at Zuccotti Park, and violence against protesters in Chicago and the like, and it just mystifies me because who in their right mind is afraid of peaceful anti-war protesters? Who views them as being a physical threat to their own safety? At the end of the day, it's the policemen on the front lines that carry out this violence against the protesters. Are these guys brainwashed, or are they just not too bright?
Well, I mean, you look at the MO of a lot of people who become police officers. I think a lot of them are people who are working out their either bullied or bullying impulses of their youth. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are not exactly well in the head who gravitate towards those sort of occupations. And that the unfortunate thing is that the whole history of the CPD here has been that, for the most part, that kind of behavior is not only tolerated but encouraged, and it's only when it becomes a huge political embarrassment, as with it did with John Burge, the infamous torture ringleader.
Yes.
Only when it becomes a huge embarrassment do they cut these guys loose. And by the way, John Burge was only fired a few weeks after the Rodney King rebellion. Certainly no coincidence with that.
And he's probably still getting a pension.
They're fighting over it right now. He's serving time in prison for perjury because, of course, our Cook County State Attorney's Office let the statute of limitations go on the torture allegations, even though they knew it about a decade ago. And this is where, when we had Anita Alvarez, who was a direct protege of Dick Devine, who was a state attorney during much of the Burge torture setups, where the state attorney's office worked hand in hand with these brutal cops. When we have Anita Alvarez crowing to the Chicago Tribune that they and the Chicago police have uncovered some great terrorist plot by 20-somethings from Florida. You have to say these people who couldn't find police torture for a period of nearly 3 decades right underneath their noses are not exactly the key cops we should be depending on to uncover terrorism. And I think anyone who's looked at, for example, the FBI raids against alleged terrorist acts being perpetrated by 20-something Arab and Muslim youth in this country, has got to say that so many of these cases, and not all these cases, are ones where you've got 20-something kids talking shit and really not planning on doing anything except for the aid given them by so-called law enforcement to not only encourage them to actually carry out acts, but give them the raw materials to do it with.
Yes.
And this is how they end up justifying their salaries, justifying their budgets. I mean, security spending, so-called, in the United States has doubled since 9/11. It's one of the few growth industries we've got in a stagnant economy. And a lot of these local law enforcement, as well as the feds, are laughing off the bank with this stuff.
So let me ask you, if I may interject. You said you had nearly a year's worth of troubles with the Chicago Police Department in the run-up to the NATO summit just to get the necessary permits, which I find absolutely astonishing. You and I both know that whatever reasons they give you, they're not the actual reasons for for them doing what they're doing, denying permits and the like. What was the official rationale or the reasons that they gave you guys whenever they turned you down for a permit to protest?
Oh, it was always various logistical considerations or technical considerations. I mean, they're not so stupid as to say, we don't like your First Amendment message, get the hell out of here, because they know that they'd lose hands down in court. And so they would purposely dress it up as something that is based upon some logistical considerations or particularities of the ordinance or their own internal regulations. I mean, at one point they had a blanket ban on the use of Daley Plaza for any demonstration between May 15th and 22nd, which just happened to be the same dates as when the both the summits were originally scheduled for. It was only when we confronted the mayor in a meeting of the Public Building Commission with cameras whirring and challenged him on that, that we got that blanket ban dropped, which they in turn nonetheless reimposed, at least partially, later against us, and then tried to use it against the National Nurses United as well for their Friday, May 18th demonstration. They were nasty at each stage of the game in terms of coming up with transparently false excuses to the point where we actually had a lot of the mainstream news reporters, if not their editors, on our side. So, for example, when the city rejected our permit app for May 20th, when we had to move it from the 19th because of the G8 summit had been nixed from Chicago, and we want to have the demonstration actually against a building full of NATO delegates as opposed to an empty building, which would have been, had we gone forth on the 19th, we put in the exact same permit app. I mean, everything right down to my electronic signature was the same, with the exception of the days. And a permit that the city had no problem with and rapidly granted before, they rejected and forced us to go into a court battle about.
Wow.
Also, we didn't get the magical pieces of paper that we needed to go forward until the Tuesday before the demonstration, even though we applied for our first permits way back late last June.
So what do you think would have happened? I mean, that's on short notice. That's literally 3 days before the permit, before the actual summit was to take place. So they basically had you working for an entire year, and it came down to 3 days before the actual event was to take place. It's really shocking, really unbelievable. It's almost surreal. It's like we're living in an Orwellian world. I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, you know, every year that they have these NATO summits, and they do have them annually, they're normally held, I believe, in Washington, D.C. And they could have been held in Washington, D.C. this year without incident. But Mayor Emanuel decided, perhaps on his own, perhaps in collusion with others, to actually have the NATO summit take place in Chicago with all the expenditures that would be necessary for quote unquote security, you know, locking down, you know, sealing off whole parts of town, et cetera, et cetera. When at the same time, you know, they closed 2 mental health clinics, hospitals within the city of Chicago to save $3 million, yet they were spending, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, in excess of $60 billion to host the summit with no real visible economic gain, even though that's what they say. You know, we got all these people coming and they're going to spend money. That's, you and I both know that's not true. So what is the real reason why it seems like Mayor Emanuel and President Obama, by extension, he is from Chicago, and Rahm Emanuel was his chief of staff up until recently. It seems like they have so much to lose and very little to gain. So the question is why? Why would they do this? Why would they choose to have the NATO summit in the city of Chicago?
Well, first, Alan, just a couple of minor factual corrections. They actually, we got our magical pieces of paper 5 days before the march.
Still
We
pretty
still got
close.
to get on the wire. The other thing is that of course they rotate the NATO summit not just to D.C. but like it was in Lisbon the other year, and they put it in different countries. So, but normally when it's here in the United States, it's always been in D.C. heretofore. This was the first time outside of that. I think what was going on here, it was testimony to the arrogance not just of Rahm Emanuel, but also the Obama administration, that they wanted to take the summit out of D.C., bring it on the road so that both Rahm Emanuel as well as Barack Obama could act presidential. That this was, whatever the hell that means. But basically, they could act like big men on the world stage. It was our speculation that this was a setup to Emanuel running for president in 2016, if not later. He has since disavowed a 2016 run, but never underestimate the arrogance of this guy. It really was an exercise in mayoral, especially, but also presidential arrogance to bring this to Chicago. It was a tremendous disruption to a lot of people's lives that had nothing to do with the protests. Deloitte and Touche, which was one of the favorite accounting firms of the mayor and his predecessor, came out with an estimate saying that the NATO summit was going to bring $126 million worth of business to Chicago. As I said to the Sun
Okay.
Times, I said, boy, we're smoking what our Deloitte and Touche friends were smoking.
Yeah.
It's a level of delusion. The official security expenditure was supposed to have been in the neighborhood of $55 million. Again, where they're getting these figures, I think it's so much stuff that's hidden in our budget. They claim that all that money was going to come from the feds and from private donations. And you just look at what the Canadians, for example, paid for their G20 summit back in 2010, close to $1 billion, according to the CBC. And they're still fighting about who's going to pick up the final tab, 2 years later. Here in Chicago, the mayor pretty much said point blank, we are not going to pick up the tab for any businesses that lose business because of this. I mean, and of course, these NATO delegates, they're not going to be coming down to the local fried fish place or rib
Right.
joint.
They're not going to a Cubs game.
Because of the fear that was broadcast throughout the city, a lot of the downtown and anywhere near the loop was a total ghost town.
They were warning people. They were telling people, dress casually so you don't get mistaken for a worker, or that so that you'll blend in with the protesters, so that there is less of a likelihood, to run into trouble with them. I mean, people were really afraid.
Well, and they shelled out millions of dollars to get a number of the conventions to alter their dates at McCormick Place. Any number of schools changed their graduation dates, proms, and all the rest of that. There was a steady drumbeat of, Armageddon's coming to the city of Chicago, so you better batten down the hatches. And it was very much a cynical attempt to scare people away from looking at what NATO is about and perhaps protesting it. Now, we did one of the good things about our permit battle. It wasn't totally useless. It educated people not just about the duplicity of this mayor and the president in terms of their real stance on civil liberties, but we were actually able to, from time to time, talk about what the violence of NATO itself. That actually half of our mental health clinics in this city are closing. Not just two, but half of them.
Wow.
Okay, we've got 100,000 homes in foreclosure in this city. We've got a $700 million budget deficit looming next year in the Board of Education.
Wait a minute. Let me just backtrack for a second. You're telling me that in the city of Chicago, a city with about 2.8 million people, approximately, that 100,000 homes are in foreclosure just within the city limits?
Yes, that's what I've been told. And we've got a $500 million budget deficit in our Chicago Transit Authority for next year. I mean, you've got a number of unions that have been taking on the chin for years now, that are now in very bitter contract disputes with the city because, of course, they've been shoveling all this money to favored campaign contributors. Arnie Duncan, who is our great school privatizer on the national scale, he got his start here under Mayor Daley. So we've got a pitched battle right now looming between the Chicago Teachers Union and the city, which has been totally screwing these teachers. And it's not about saving money or actually improve performance because any honest accounting of these charter schools shows that there hasn't been any dramatic increase in performance.
Because many of them are run for profit.
Well, they're run for profit, but also they're able to selectively choose who attends, and they expel the ones who might bring down their test scores. Whereas the public schools, the truly public schools, have to take all comers. And from an administration standpoint, we've got a whole number of these charter school leaders who are making more than the president of the Chicago Board of Education, and yet they're only overseeing maybe 5 or 6 schools. And so it's become a very convenient way for this mayor to shovel funds to community allies, so-called, who in turn support the mayor for his election and presumed re-election.
Well, I wasn't going to bring up this topic, but since you did bring it up, and since it is of such tremendous importance, I was watching an interview with a Chicago public school teacher at an Occupy Chicago rally, and she was talking about the role of the police in the community, not just riding up and making arrests on street corners and that sort of thing, but actually within the schools, that there's actually not only an increased presence of Chicago police in schools, arresting kids in school, roughing up kids in school, that sort of thing, but that there was also an office for an armed forces recruiter in the school, which I find shocking. So could you expound a little more on that?
Yes, absolutely. Chicago has, according to those who know far better than I do, has got the most militarized big city school system in the United States. I mean, we've got all these so-called military academies. He's partnering with both the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines. These ROTC programs in the schools. They have far more infected our city of Chicago schools here. It's part of the so-called smart defense that is now the rage amongst Pentagon-type planners, where they realize that the amount of money for the military, living as we are in the declining empire, is getting tighter and tighter, and so they try and co-opt and coerce non-military institutions such as our secondary school system to serve their means, because they don't have the economic heft that they did a few decades ago to support this military infrastructure. And so it has a directly corrosive effect, not just on the situation abroad, but on our society here at home. We're a much more militarized society. And it's affecting our secondary schools here in the city of Chicago, where people feel like if they're going to get a job, they're going to need to join these ROTC programs and have an opportunity then to go to school on the GI Bill and all that sort of stuff. And of course, they get sold a bill of goods. It's basically about what the true educational benefits there are with the military, because remarkably few service people are able to access them, but it is part and parcel of a bigger picture. I mean, one of the things.
What is the bigger picture? Because it seems what they're doing is completely counterproductive, and destructive to society. So there must be a greater goal here. What is the greater goal? What is it that they're trying to accomplish? What's the end game?
Alan, it depends on which society you're talking about. I don't think we're talking about a singular society here. I think you're talking about a society of the 1% versus a society for the 99%. And there isn't one America, there's two Americas. That this drive for empire abroad, this alleged war on terrorism, it is nothing of the sort. It is about U.S. domination of other areas of the globe. I mean, we've got a government which claims to represent 4% of the world's population, which has got troops in 130 countries around the world. It basically says that the 4% government is allowed to, is entitled to dominate the other 96%, which is such a patently obnoxious and undemocratic notion that, of course, they have to dress it up with verbiage like fighting war on terror, where the reason why there is terrorism, going right back to 2001 and before, is people are resentful of U.S. troops occupying their country.
Right, and if I may just right, and that's an argument that we hear very often, and I think it does definitely have merit. But a lot of these so-called cases where they capture these so-called terrorists who were supposedly trying to orchestrate a plot, like the Cleveland Five, like those three gentlemen we discussed in Bridgeport, like the Newburgh Four in New York, where you're from. Well, you're from a different part of the state, I think, but it seems like these are all creations of one agency or another within the government, and it seems to me like this whole war on terrorism is a farce. I mean, is it even real? Is this all even real, or is this just a creation of our government to have this sort of boogeyman to keep people in a state of fear so that they can advance their own agenda?
Well, I think obviously they're not terribly pleased when the coal got blown up or when the trade towers went down, but at the same time it's very useful to them propagandistically, and they try and shout down anyone who might have the temerity to ask, what is it that the United States is doing that causes people to become terrorists? What is it that Why is Al-Qaeda able to recruit people? Why is it not just a tiny, tiny cell with no followers around the globe? And what we've seen, of course, is that the United States is, in effect, the greatest recruiter to terrorism. Iraq, the country of Iraq, didn't have an Al-Qaeda chapter before the '03 invasion by the United States. Today, it supposedly got the largest Al-Qaeda chapter in the world, and
but do you ever wonder?
It's a direct result of that.
But do you ever, without sounding too conspiratorial, do you ever question the veracity of a lot of these things? I mean, how do you know if what they're saying is even true?
Well, I think the demonstrable crimes of the United States government in terms of occupying other people's lands without their consent. I mean, take the country of Philippines, for example. They have a clause in their constitution which says that no foreign troops shall be on their soil. And of course, the United States routinely thumbs its nose at that with whatever quisling government happens to be ruling the Philippines at the time. Pakistan, the Pakistani parliament has passed resolution after resolution saying no more drone attacks, no more CIA bases within our country, and of course it continues on and on and on. I mean, and those are just two of the more egregious examples that are demonstrably provable, that you don't have to say, well, the evidence seems to suggest this. It quite transparently shows that. I think this is one of the great gains of the WikiLeaks revelations, is that they really showed the true intent of American diplomacy. I, for example, due to my gay rights activism, have traveled to Russia a number of times and supported LGBT activists there who don't even have the right to peacefully demonstrate. The government routinely bans the demonstrations there and roughs up and allows roughs up the demonstrators with its police and allows at the same time neo-fascists to demonstrate and beat up LGBT activists. And yet the sole focus the of American diplomatic maneuvers vis-a-vis Russia. It's not about, of course, defending LGBT and other activists in that country, but to simply try and recruit Russia into the great encirclement of Iran. Everything's focused on
But
that.
isn't it?
The
But
right thing.
what I'm getting at is, isn't it easier to have a boogeyman? So you know, people's rationale for doing the things that they do aside, isn't it in some ways? Isn't it an intentional creation on the part of the CIA, of the moneyed interests that control our government? Because that way they have an enemy that during the Cold War, the Russians, the communists, we're being infiltrated by communists and the threat of nuclear war and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you remember that, being when you were a young man. Isn't this just the new boogeyman that's basically been a creation of the U.S. government?
Well, I think you have to say that terrorists do exist, but you have to say, well, what gives them a mass base? What allows them to recruit? I mean, and clearly the actions of the United States government. Anyone looking at it, why would anyone like want to join up with the Taliban given their own horrible human rights record? Well, you have to say, well, the United States and its occupation of that country is the greatest recruiter.
Let's talk about that for a second, because we are short on time. I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but we are
That's
a little bit.
okay.
So let's talk about that, because that's a very, very important issue. That's almost the elephant in the room. Tell me a little bit more, not so much, not just about NATO, but also about the conflict in Afghanistan and how the conflict in Afghanistan and NATO are basically intertwined.
Well, I mean, one of the things, Alan, that we kept on saying whenever these reporters came at us with the issue of violence is, did you know that last year in America's longest war in its history, Afghanistan, that a record number of Afghans died just last year in this war that the NATO summit's going to tell us the lights at the end of the tunnel about, to borrow a phrase from the Vietnam War? Did you know that 450 people a day are displaced in Afghanistan? That 250 kids a day died due to malnutrition? I mean, the
Is
list
there
goes
is
on.
there
The violence that is perpetrated by NATO.
is there an objective? Is there a clear cut end game, or is this just designed to be continuous, to be a continuous conflict?
Well, I think they would like to wind it down. And you look at the trajectory of the Obama administration with the George W. Bush administration, and the central thing you got to
Andy?
see is a continuity in so many of their policy. Administration took the baton there, but that still didn't keep the Pentagon from a few months ago asking for $3 billion more for that supposedly ended war. And then Obama, of course, escalated the war in Afghanistan, escalated the war in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. I mean, just this past, over the last 12 months, according to the Center for Investigative Journalism, the level of drone attacks in Yemen now equals that of the horrible level already seen in Pakistan. And we've seen what horrible things that's done to the internal politics of Pakistan, that level of drone attacks. And yet the Obama administration is now repeating that disaster in Yemen. And so really one of the central themes that we had for our protest here in Chicago is that whoever is elected in November, we're going to have a pro-war, pro 1% president come January. And that's why we need to be out in the streets, is that being out in the streets is the only thing historically which has prevented war or gotten the United States out of wars.
But aren't there people profiting? Aren't there people profiting from the Afghanistan war? Isn't that the real reason why we're there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's any number of lowlife, both within Afghanistan as well as, of course, even greater lowlife here in the United States, who are profiting enormously. I mean, just look at our own Boeing Corporation, headquartered here in Chicago, which doled out millions of dollars for the Welcoming Committee for NATO, and yet has not paid a single dime in federal taxes since 2008. Got some $31 million in state and city money from both government entities, I should add, that are bleeding red ink left, right, backwards, and forwards. Plus, of course, a property tax holiday, I believe, for something like 20 years.
Wow.
I mean, they are making enormous profits off of this war, and that's just one corporation. I
And they
think
just want to keep the
also,
gravy train going.
yeah, there's that. There's those with a direct interest, but also, why is it that the say the Chicago Tribunes or whatever the world are so welcoming of NATO? And I think you have to say that there's a bigger corporate interest here beyond the individual defense contractors, that they see themselves as benefiting from the expansion and maintenance of American empire. That's what there was this old phrase back in the during the Vietnam War, that really the reason why the United States pursued that war, even after it was so clearly lost, was not due to the particular natural resources of Vietnam, which were not enough to justify that kind of expenditure, but to preserve, they were afraid about the loss of quote unquote U.S. credibility.
Well, weren't defense contractors and international bankers also making a killing off that war?
And there were absolutely, Alan. I'm just saying that there's broader strategic interests as to why big businesses that aren't directly making a killing off of that war, why they support them as well. Yeah, I mean, there's the Halliburtons and the Boeings, which are the particularly nasty ones, but there is a broader pro 1% agenda involved with empire, and that is that as the United States is less able to compete economically against its main rivals, a rising China, a still strong Europe. I mean, the United States came out of World War II with half the world's gross national product. It's got some 23% only of gross domestic product. The figures, obviously, GDP versus GNP, a little bit different, but the main point of it is the United States, like other declining empires in history, is no longer able to compete head-to-head economically as effectively as it has historically. And the temptation for declining empires like that, economic empires, is that they increasingly reach for their guns as a way to pry open markets or keep open markets. And you
But
can
it
see
seems
this
to me, it seems to me that they're intentionally destroying companies in order to give out contracts to rebuild these countries to their friends. That's what it seems like to me.
yeah, well, and what was a big purpose of the Marshall Plan? I mean, the requirement was, of course, the buying of U.S. goods. What is the purpose of so much U.S. aid? It's always got strings attached saying that whatever goods that are purchased with the so-called aid must be from American firms, even though the American firms might be charging far more for the same goods as more feisty economic
Right,
competitor from another nation.
right. You know, it
But
seems it seems to me, you know, I mean, if you kind of step back and take a look at the campaign in Afghanistan without realizing some of the things that we've just discussed, it doesn't make any sense because most of the people there that are fighting us are only fighting us because we're there, because we bombed their house, because we killed their whole family. So they're only fighting us because we're there. So we're going to stay there and fight them over there because we're fighting them because we're there. It doesn't make any
I
sense.
mean, there are natural resources in Afghanistan, particularly natural gas. I understand
And lithium, they just discovered
that they are
a
interested.
trillion dollars.
Yeah, and I think the Libya versus Syria example brings up, why is it the United States and its NATO partners bomb the crap out of Libya, and yet Syria it's continued on in this realm. Not that I'm advocating it by any means for NATO bombing Syria, but the fact of the matter remains that Syria doesn't have significant oil and Libya does. And that when a U.S.-backed dictator in Libya is losing his shit, then they want to basically have someone in there who can keep control. I mean, this country's got a long history of propping up whether Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines or Anastasia Somoza of
Or
Nicaragua or
Mohammed Suharto in Indonesia.
they will back them until the last moment but when they can't control their own people, then they'll cynically choose, change their tune. I mean, this same United States government, which is clucking about the horrible human rights record of Assad or of Gaddafi, had no problem extraordinarily renditioning people to the torture chambers of those two governments, as was exposed through the WikiLeaks and other revelations. So the United States is totally cynical about human rights, regardless of Democratic or Republican administrations. I mean, their support for the brutal Saudi dictatorship, which invaded Bahrain and crushed that country's democracy movement last,
Yes.
certainly
Yes.
demonstrated. I mean, every single reason the United States used for threatening war against Iran is available in spades just by looking at the Saudi dictatorship. The United States pours millions and millions of dollars to each year.
Well, I would like to talk about the Saudi monarchy because that's very, very essential to the story. If you want to understand really what's going on, it is important to understand the House of Saud and about the relationship between the House of Saud and our government. But I would like to bring this up before we're out of time. There are a couple issues with regards to the Afghanistan conflict, which get virtually no coverage. Number one is the oil pipeline from Central Asia through Afghanistan that Michael Moore had referenced in Fahrenheit 9/11. Another is the fact, that they discovered what they estimate to be about $1 trillion worth of lithium, which is used in every cell phone and soon to be every electric car battery. $1 trillion. And also opium. Most of the world's opium, poppy, heroin, comes from Afghanistan. And that's a source of tremendous cash infusion for our banks. Can you talk a little bit more about any of those things?
Well, and just to take the whole drugs issue, I mean, anyone that's got a knowledge about the true history of the Indochina-U.S. war knows the role of the CIA in using drug money to continue its dirty wars in places like Laos and Cambodia. And the vaunted Northern Alliance with which the United States allied in its drive to take over Afghanistan was thick as thieves in the whole trade. In fact, the Taliban government, before it was overthrown by the United States, had taken some $31 million in U.S. aid to do opium eradication in that country. They actually did, from their standpoint, actually a pretty decent job of doing it, which is what lost them the popular support among much of the Afghan population,
But
because they were so
isn't it a
brutal.
staged campaign?
Well, I mean, I mean, I think they were true believers in terms of trying to eliminate opium use and production in the country, and they were happy to take $31 million in U.S. aid to do it. What happened, though, is you have a country that was so utterly devastated by the war against the Russians, and then, of course, the Civil War, that the traditional agriculture was no longer able to support people. What was left was far simpler opium production. I mean, Afghanistan historically had a very intricate a series of irrigation systems that were utterly devastated by the years of war. And so people have to survive. And as we see in Mexico today, that you wipe out the basis for people making a living via traditional agriculture, then people are going to make a living by hook or by crook. And in this case, of course, it was the opium production. When the Taliban government was actually quite effective in cracking down on that, they undercut their own popular base, which is why the Taliban government fell like a house of cards when the United States invaded, ironically
But
enough.
you know,
And just if I could continue on the
sure,
same
sure.
theme here, Alan, when that's why when Karzai took over as basically the figurehead, Pashtun figurehead for a Northern Alliance government, in order to keep their shit together, they had to have his brother, who was recently assassinated.
Who's the
They
biggest drug dealer in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, that was the key to the so-called social stability of Afghanistan, and any move to take a serious eradication would only help boost support for the Taliban and undercut the Karzai government, as the Taliban government had been undercut for the same reasons before it.
Okay, and last question, and this is very, very important. Um, you know, with regards to what we just spoke about, with the opium trade in Afghanistan and with the chaos that's presently ensuing in Mexico, our neighbors to the south, which is basically threatening the stability of the country and undermining, the power of the states, right on our border. That seems more like a real security issue than what's happening in Afghanistan. But it seems to me that the common thread between all these things, they seem to be orchestrated for some kind of greater goal of the military and financial elites. Aren't they basically trying to orchestrate controlled conflicts in different parts of the world to consolidate control? And is doesn't that tie into NATO? Isn't that what this is all really about?
Well, Alan, I think sometimes things can spin out of control even beyond what they want. I think that's currently what you're seeing in Mexico. One of the things that we argued all along was that it annoyed the mainstream media to no end, was that all of these issues are actually very much interconnected. The violence that you see on the streets of Chicago is indirectly related to the violence of NATO. The violence that you see in Mexico is related to the violence of NATO and the G8. And here's how. I mean, for example, for Mexico, the United States, as one of the G8 nations, pushed through the NAFTA treaty. What did the NAFTA treaty do? What did it mean? It meant that U.S. subsidized grain, heavily subsidized grain, flooded the markets of Mexico because there were no longer trade barriers to it. And
Right.
of course, the United States was unfairly trading because we got these huge agricultural subsidies. What it meant is it wiped out the rural economy of Mexico and other corn-producing areas of Central America, which meant that thousands upon thousands of people had no decent income anymore. They flood to the cities. They need to get income by hook or by crook, and there's the drugs trade. And that's perversely how the United States has actually promoted the drugs trade in much of Central America. I don't think that they set out and planned to do it, but because they're so damn greedy, they end up creating the instability in that instance that I don't think that they personally want, but they're certainly happy to sell arms to the Mexican government in order to continue the war, because that's the only way they got of dealing with violence is with by even greater violence. The connection between the violence here in our city, and we've had a huge spike in it this year,
Yes.
is simply this: if you're spending all this money on these on these arms, I mean, the United States spending as much on arms as the rest of the world combined, and NATO 70% of world military expenditure, then you're going to be hollowing out the very industries, the very social programs that might lead people to stay away from the drugs trade. But we've got a situation in the Great Recession here, Alan, where not only did the 25 and 30 somethings getting out of school, they found that they had a lesser job prospects. because everyone at each stage of the game was trading down. I mean, those who were in their 40s and so forth were taking the jobs that normally school leavers would take. But in turn, and I think this is the great untold story, is that those people, the college-educated ones, were taking the jobs that the 20-somethings, et cetera, without college educations would have taken.
Right.
And so just a few years ago, even before the Great Recession hit, there was a Sun-Times article that said that youth unemployment in the city of Chicago was the greatest level since the statistics began being collected in 1947.
Wow.
And so you wonder why kids go to the drugstore. It's not like everyone says, oh, I want to end up 25 and dead. It's there aren't jobs for particularly black youth.
Right.
And so people need to make a living, need to keep their crap together somehow or some way, and that's what fuels the drugs trade. That's what fuels teenage prostitution.
So
And
where do
so on.
where do you see all this ending? I mean, it seems
Well,
like we're just in the midst of chaos on all fronts. I mean, what are things going to come to a head? Is there going
well,
to be
until we
where
have
does
a
this all
truly strong offensive side, Alan. Well, you can't predict just when and where that will happen, Alan, but I think history has certainly shown that at one point or another, people will push back on a massive scale. I mean, the example that I like to point to is Egypt, where you talk to any Egyptian activist who's of an older generation, and they will say that for decades they despaired of their people ever fighting back against the Mubarak and preceding dictatorship. That they saw their people as the sheep of the Middle East. And of course, now here we are in 2012, and few people would say that the Egyptian people have through their struggle, have won back their humanity. The kind of world that I'm looking to, Alan, the kind of world that I think that can start really, truly reversing this, we've seen glimpses of at various eras, not just in our own country's history, but other countries. And that is when people begin building a politics of solidarity, where people who are, for example, gay rights activists see that they've got common cause with anti-racist activists, who see that they've got common cause with pro-peace activists and labor activists and immigrant rights activists. That was the culture of solidarity that we began to see in the late 60s and early 70s that truly had the other side frightened.
But
Because
isn't
they know that is when
but isn't the other side even more frightened now because now we have the internet, now we have social networking, now we have YouTube, so people are able to communicate with each other and do things that they couldn't have in times past. So aren't the ruling elite very, very nervous about that? Because
well,
they can put
I
back.
mean, they are nervous, yes, about the new communication devices, but it also gives them plenty of opportunities to snoop. Alan, I think actually much more fundamentally, they're nervous about the fact that here we are apparently heading for a social crisis that may explode, who knows, this year, next year, maybe 5 years from now, who knows. But we are heading for a social crisis in this country, but not in the same during the 1960s. Back then, President Johnson could at least attempt to have both guns and butter. But now, thanks to the relative decline of the U.S. empire versus other emerging great powers such as China, they can't do the same things that they might have done or at least attempted to do during the Vietnam era. And I think that's really what's got them scared shitless.
But
That
don't people
they
like you and I have access to information? You know, I found out about things that I would have needed a top security clearance to find out about, but now they're out there in the open, in the ether. I mean, that's very, very empowering, and you know, it's harder for them to keep things under wraps.
it is a very useful tool, but I would suggest that far more fundamental than even the communications revolution, Alan, is that they are entering a crisis in terms of their imperial project abroad. At the same time, they are facing a profound economic crisis. And so the kind of fat that they had on the system back in the 1960s, with which they could hope to buy people off with this or that social program, they are much less able to do today because they are in cutthroat competition with rising economic powers, and so they feel that they don't have that same luxury to buy people off. But that isn't to say that we can't win fundamental, wide-ranging reforms. I mean, not revolutions, but reforms within an economic crisis. I mean, the Great Depression, where the fact that we had three general strikes here in this country in the year 1934, that we had the sit-downs of the factories, the takeover of the factories in the mid and late 30s, that's what forced things like the institution of Social Security and the 8-hour day and so forth. That was actually that very active labor movement that wasn't just out and demonstrating, but actually taking over the factories, taking over the levers of profit in this country. They were able to do that at a time of 1/3 of the nation being unemployed. So it's much more difficult to launch those successful battles when you're facing severe economic crisis. It takes a much higher level of struggle than we've experienced in our lifetimes, but it does show what is possible. And I think that's something that we have to aspire to, is that kind of wide-ranging movement where people from seemingly disconnected sectors are in solidarity with each other. I mean, I think that was one of the great gains of the 1960s and early 70s, where, for example, the gay liberation organizations on the East Coast were in solidarity with the Panthers, which in turn made the Panthers wake up to their own homophobia and become the first quote-unquote non-gay organization to endorse gay liberation. I mean, that kind of act of solidarity is what we urgently need today, and not fall for the sort of Tea Party, let's blame the immigrants or let's blame public sector workers or what have you nonsense.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, Andy Thayer, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Alan. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Bye bye.